Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third session in our ongoing series, History of English Literature. The weather was exceptionally nice today, so I decided to step out of my man cave and record the video for you today outside. I really hope the noise canceling feature on my microphone works well because there's a lot of noise going on around here. There's construction going on, so I really hope that it cancels out all of those background noises. Today, we are going to talk about the third stage in our exploration of the history of English literature. And the period that we're going to work on today is called Middle English. This type of literature flourished in the 14th and 15th centuries, and we're going to talk about them gradually throughout the course of this video. We will talk about important historical events that took place in those two centuries, but we will also talk about influential writers both in England and Europe in these two centuries. And of course, we will make passing references to their major works of literature. And after today's session, we will be ready to dive deeper into the individual works which have defined Anglo-Saxon period, the Anglo-Norman period, as well as the Middle English period. So our next video will be an exploration and a deep analytical discussion of the major works of these three different sections. So if you're ready, just let's begin our presentation. Okay, so around the year 1200, and this is the first thing that you really have to know, English was, step by step beginning to be trusted by the major writers in England with their works. So previously, a lot of writers preferred Latin or French when it was time for them to produce something. But English had become a trusted language by then, and so more and more people were no longer afraid to write their works in English because they knew that English had was sophisticated enough, and then people were beginning to trust it. And that's why we have the production of so many English books around the year 1200. Now, several authors of religious and didactic works in English stated that they began to write in English simply for the benefit of those who do not understand Latin or French. So that was the other impetus for some of these writers to begin writing in English. They were saying that there are large groups of people who cannot understand Latin or French, and if we don't produce our works of literature in English, they will have difficulty keeping up. And so one of the other reasons why people began writing in English was to give the people the opportunity to read something in their own native languages. And so by 1360s, the linguistic, political, and the cultural climate had been prepared enough for the flowering of Middle English literature in the writings of some of the most influential authors of the period, Geoffrey Chaucer, Gower, Langland, and of course the anonymous poet of the Gawain poem. So let's talk about the 14th century first. Now, two of the most dominant issues in this period were, of course, war and disease. And these two issues were prevalent throughout the Middle Ages. Let's talk about some examples. In 1348, the first and the most virulent and violent epidemic of the bubonic plague hit Europe. And of course, it killed thousands of people, millions of people. It was nicknamed the Black Death because of its cruel nature, and it wiped out a quarter to a third of the population. Now, Giovanni Boccaccio, one of the most influential writers of the period, describes the plague in Florence in his seminal work Decameron. And this passage from Giovanni Boccaccio vividly portrays the severity of the plague. Let's read it in its entirety. So many corpses would arrive in front of a church every day, and at every hour, the amount of holy ground for burials was certainly insufficient for the ancient custom of giving each body its individual place. When all the graves were full, huge trenches were dug in all of the cemeteries of the churches, and into them the new arrivals were dumped by the hundreds, and they were packed in there with dirt, one on top of another, like a ship's cargo, until the trench was filled. Now, this beautiful, but at the same time very dark and gloomy passage reveals how severe Black Death was in this period. Now, as I said, so this was the violence part of it, but there was also a lot of war. That was the disease part of it. Let's now talk about war and violence. In 1381, there were certain attempts to enforce wage controls over people. And the governments of the period wanted to collect more taxes, which of course created an uprising, especially in the rural areas, in Essex and in Kent. Now, most of these people were unhappy with the new taxes because they believed that they were not making enough money to begin with, and so it would be unfair to try to pay more taxes to the government. Now, the insurgents burned down the palace of the Duke of Lancaster, and then they beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury, and of course, the Treasurer of England, who had taken refuge in the Tower of London. So you can see how angry they were. The church had also become a target of popular resentment because it was among the greatest of the oppressive landowners in the land, and because they were landowners, they demanded more land taxes. And because of the wealth that they had, the worldly uh, kind of greed that people saw in the church, which was supposed to be an ethereal, a heavenly institution, this, of course, created a lot of hatred towards the church. Now, I've again screenshotted a passage from the Norton Anthology of English Literature, and I think we should read the passage in its entirety because it's important. These calamities and upheavals, nevertheless, did not stem the growth of international trade and the influence of the merchant class. So, war and disease were prevalent in England in this period, but at the same time, England was becoming more and more prosperous through its practice of international trade. So, when, for example, Geoffrey Chaucer wants to portray a merchant, we see the budding at the beginning stages, the burgeoning stages of capitalism based on credit and interest. Now, cities like London ran their own affairs under politically powerful mayors and aldermen, and so kings had enough power to kind of do away with any kind of dissent which was going on in the period. So, but they also, of course, had a lot of financial needs, and that's why they had to exert taxes on people. But as I said, uh, a lot of people were not really happy with this, and that's why uh, people began to protest, and of course, they wanted to abolish the government because the government wanted to ask for more taxes. And that's why, of course, we had so many different types of wars and conflicts in this period. Now, in the 14th century, a few poets and intellectuals achieved the status and the respect formerly accorded only to the ancients. Now, as we said, a lot of significant writers, Latin and French writers, had already established themselves as giants on the literary landscape. But it was in the 14th century that new writers emerged, and these new writers could also claim to have achieved fame in their lifetimes. Now, in the previous video, we talked about a couple of these writers who had successfully created or improved the genre called romance. We talked about Marie de France and, of course, Chrétien de Troyes. But it was in this period that new writers emerged. Dante, for instance, was one of them. He made himself the protagonist of his most famous work, the Divine Comedy, which was a sacred poem, as he himself called it. And then he tried to reveal the secrets of the afterlife in this work. Now, after his death, the manuscripts of the work were provided with lengthy commentaries as though it were scripture. Now, a lot of people really trusted Dante when he said that this was a sacred poem, and that's why a lot of people revered the poem. A lot of people treated it as though it were scripture. And so there were a lot of like public readings of it. There were a lot of lectures going on entirely dedicated and devoted to Dante's The Divine Comedy. Another influential writer who gained fame in this period was Francis Petrarch. Now, Petrarch, I'm sure you've heard of the Petrarchan sonnet. That's what we usually know him for. But Petrarch won international reputation as a man of letters. He wrote primarily in Latin and contrived to have himself crowned a poet laureate in the emulation of the Roman poets whose works he imitated. But of course, his most famous work is the sonnet sequence that he wrote in Italian. And of course, it's not really something insignificant because he's credited with having created a Petrarchan sonnet. The sonnet, which is usually divided into two parts: the first 8 lines, the octave, and the last 6 lines, the sestet. The first part beginning to discuss the problems of the lover in his relationship with the beloved, and then the final 6 lines revealing the solution to his predicament. It was based on this form of sonnet that a lot of other writers in the Renaissance tried to continue in his footsteps and improve the genre of the sonnet. Shakespeare, in particular, created the Shakespearean sonnet, of course, by introducing some changes to the Petrarchan model. Giovanni Boccaccio was also among the influential writers of the period. He was among Petrarch's most ardent admirers, and he carried on a literary correspondence with him. We talked about Boccaccio's Decameron. It's one of those kinds of books that we call frame stories or a story within a story. Chaucer himself was influenced by Boccaccio's Decameron when he wanted to write the Canterbury Tales, which we will talk about next session. But Boccaccio also was one of those influential writers of the period. But we can't really talk about the 14th century without discussing Geoffrey Chaucer. Now, Geoffrey Chaucer had read these authors along with the ancient Roman poets, and of course, he tried to emulate them. He drew on their works in his works. Now, Chaucer has written so many influential works, which we will talk about next week. But I just want to give you a very broad descriptions of some of these interesting books and pieces, which I think are relevant to our discussion today. Now, Chaucer's Clerk's Tale, for instance, is based on a Latin version that Petrarch made from the last tale in Boccaccio's Decameron. I specifically mentioned this bit of information because I just want you to know how these writers really influenced each other. Maybe we can trace some form of intertextuality here. So Chaucer had based one of his tales on one of Petrarch's works, which was in turn based on one of Boccaccio's stories in the Decameron. So intertextuality was definitely a big thing here. Chaucer, of course, unlike the other poets I just named, never really got the fame that he wanted, that his role models had. But it was only in the following centuries that he would be canonized as the father of English poetry. And of course, there's so much to Geoffrey Chaucer, and I will make sure I will talk about him next week in a lot of detail. But another influential English writer of the period was, of course, William Langland. Langland was a staunch critic of the church and the state at the same time. But of course, he was no radical. Now, he wrote a very famous work that we know about and we all love called Piers Plowman. And in that work, he kind of tones down his attacks. Like in his own previous, not his previous life, but generally speaking, he was a staunch critic of corruption, especially in the church and in the state. But when he wanted to write his literary work, because he knew that people in the church and of course the state are probably going to read this, he kind of toned it down. And so, of course, Langland does not really condone any form of rebellion. And of course, the kind of religion that he preaches is not revolutionary. But it's interesting for us to talk about Piers Plowman also next week, because it is an honest description and portrayal of searching for the best way of life, of finding the way to salvation. And so once again, if you hear background noises, I apologize. I am outside, but of course I'm enjoying the weather, so you should too. Um, so we will talk about Piers Plowman as well and next week. I just wanted to mention that William Langland was also a very, very influential writer here. He was also like his status as a significant writer in the 14th century is also because he was part of the alliterative revival in English. Again, if you remember, we talked about the Anglo-Saxon poetry, the Old English poetry, and we said that most of the works produced in that period were written in alliterative verse. But of course, alliteration and alliterative verse uh, were forgotten during the Anglo-Norman period, and it was William Langland who was part of a group of other writers who revived this kind of poetry in later centuries, in the 14th century specifically. Now, another important and a third major late 14th century English poet who was really, really important in the development of English as a standard and sophisticated language to be trusted with works of literature was John Gower. Now, his first and second large works are written in French and, of course, in Latin, respectively. But his most important work, and this is something that, again, we usually associate him with, called Confessio Amantis, which was like written in 1390, is written in English, and it is written in couplets. Now, as we said, John Gower's first two works were satires, and they were written in French and Latin. But the Confessio Amantis, by contrast, broaches political and ethical issues, and so it is different. And it just has a very, very different and unique angle. Its primary narrative concerns the treatment of a suffering lover. Now, his therapy consists of listening to and understanding many other narratives, many of which are drawn from classical sources. So, like Chaucer, Gower anglicizes and absorbs classical Latin literature. So, he does talk about issues, political and ethical issues, but in the form of an agonizingly like beautiful work or narrative about a lover who's in agony, and he has to, of course, learn a lot of other narratives as a way of curing his illness. The works of a fourth major 14th century English poet who unfortunately remains anonymous is only known through one single surviving manuscript, which means that we have one manuscript, one book, let's say, and this book or manuscript includes four beautiful works, four beautiful poems called Cleanness, Patience, Pearl, and of course, none other than Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The writer of these four different poems is believed to be one person. But as I said, unfortunately, he's anonymous. We don't know who he or she is. But we do have these works in one single manuscript. And of course, we will talk about them next week. So, what are these works about? Well, of course, Cleanness and Patience. They are biblical narratives written on those two values, cleanness and like cleanliness, and of course, patience. They are written in alliterative verse. Pearl is a moving dream vision in which a grief-stricken father is visited and consoled by his dead child, who has been transformed into a queen in the kingdom of heaven. And of course, one of the finest of all English romances, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. We will talk about this next week, so don't miss it. Now, I just want to give you a plot summary of the Gawain poem, and then, of course, we will go into details and analyze it next week. The plot of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight involves a folklore motive of a challenge by a supernatural visitor. So, a supernatural visitor offers a challenge to a knight, and because the knight wants to prove his worth, again, let's not forget what we talked about in the previous videos. We said that throughout this period, Christian values are important, but so are pagan values, and kinship, and of course chivalry are among those values. So most of the romances which were written in the period are about knights who are not from like high status families. They are not from noble families, so they have to prove their worth by doing extraordinary deeds, or by, for example, accepting challenges from supernatural creatures. Now, the origins of this story like go back to an Irish tale, an old Irish tale, but the Gawain poet has tried to introduce some changes to that tale, old Irish tale, and that's why we have a significant romance in English. So, as I said, like these challenges, which usually happen in King Arthur's court, were very prevalent in the literature of the Middle Ages, and the Gawain poet has also tried to use this. So the poet has a sophisticated awareness of the genre of romance as a literary genre, and of course, he uses this genre to play a game with both the heroes and the reader's expectations of what is supposed to happen in the romance. So, like the poem really plays with our expectations, because we expect a certain kind of action to take place, because we are all too familiar with the King Arthur romances, but then we are surprised when we get to the later parts of the work, when we realize that the writer is actually introducing a twist in the story. Another influential writer in the 14th century that you guys have to really know about is, of course, a woman, a female writer called Julian of Norwich. Now, she's the fifth major writer of this period, and she's also the first known woman writer in the English vernacular. She was the anchoress, uh, and she's usually known as Anchoress Julian, and she participated in the continental tradition of visionary writing, which of course was very popular among women. So so one thing you have to keep in mind about Julian is that while very carefully negotiating the dangers of writing as a woman and of writing sophisticated theology in the vernacular, she manages to produce visionary writing that is at once penetrating and, of course, serene. So she's also an influential writer, and you guys have to know about her. Now that we have finished talking about the 14th century, let's move on to the literature of the 15th century. But let's begin with a few historical events which I think you have to know about. In 1399, the Duke of Lancaster, called Henry Bolingbroke, deposed his cousin Richard II, and he in turn became Henry IV. Now, he successfully defended his crown against several insurrections and passed it on to Henry V, who briefly united the country once more and achieved one last apparently decisive victory over the French at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. But of course, Henry V experienced a premature death in 1422, and this left England exposed to a civil war, a very violent civil war known as the War of the Roses. And the reason why we call it the War of the Roses is because the rose was the emblem of the House of Lancaster. Now, these wars did not end until 1485, when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field and got to the throne as Henry VII, and of course the Tudor dynasty was established. So these are some of the most important historical events that you guys have to know about. When it comes to literary productions, the most prolific poet of the 15th century was a monk called John Litgate, who produced Dream Visions, A Life of the Virgin, translations of French religious allegories, a Troy book, The Siege of Thebes, which he framed as a New Canterbury Tales, and of course, probably his most important work, The Fall of Princesses, which is a 36,000 line poem, and it is a free translation of a French work, which itself is based on a Latin work by Boccaccio. Now, this Fall of Princesses is really, really important for us because it illustrates the late medieval idea of tragedy, namely that like emperors and kings and other famous men enjoy power and fortune only to be cast down in misery. So John Litgate is really, really important for us because he seems to have popularized this notion of medieval tragedy for us. The other significant poem of the first half of the 15th century is, of course, Thomas Huxley. Now, like Litgate, Huxley also wrote for powerful Lancasterian patrons. Most of the writers in this period wrote for patrons who would support them with monetary prizes. But of course, his poetry is strikingly private and painfully concerned, as it often is, with his own penury and mental instability. His most famous work is probably a poem called My Complaint, which of course you can look up and read and enjoy. But I want to touch upon a few other issues which were really important in the 15th century. Now, during this period, the Lancasters, who were in power, reacted to any kind of suggestion of reformation in draconian ways, which means in a very harsh and unforgiving manner. They introduced measures into law that would allow the burning of people who would renounce the religion. They also introduced a series of measures designed to censor any kind of publication related to literature in English in 1409. And so, although religious publications were produced in this period, they were produced under greater surveillance. Social, economic, and literary life continued just like the previous centuries, even though there were a lot of wars going on, civil war, international war going on, because England was a prosperous country through international trade. Now, there were certain literary productions which also happened, and now we want to talk about them. So, one of the ways that people could see the prosperity of their towns was through mystery plays. These plays were a sequence or a cycle of plays based on the Bible, and they were usually produced by city guilds, which were like organizations, each in favor of specific trade or craft. Now, we have so many successful writers in the period who tried to use these mystery plays to comment on satirically on the social ills of the times, and so it's important for us to uh, do research on them. Of course, we will talk about them next week. Another form of literary production, which was really popular in this day and age in the 15th century, was the morality play, in which personified vices and virtues struggle for the soul of mankind and for the salvation of every man. These morality plays were performed by professional players. And of course, these were the precursors of the professional theater in the reign of Elizabeth I, and of course, the plays of Marlowe and Shakespeare in the Renaissance period. Any discussion of the Middle Ages, of Middle English, would be incomplete without talking about Sir Thomas Mallerie. The works of Sir Thomas Mallerie gave the definitive form in English to the legend of King Arthur and his knights. Mallerie spent years in prison, Englishing a series of Arthurian romances, or Anglicizing a series of Arthurian romances that he translated and abridged chiefly from several enormously long 13th century French prose romances. Mallerie was a passionate devotee of chivalry, which he personified in his hero, Sir Lancelot. And in the jealousies and rivalries that finally break up the Round Table and destroy Arthur's kingdom, Mallerie saw a distant image of the civil wars of his own time, namely the War of the Roses that we just discussed. Now, a manuscript of Mallerie's works fell into the hands of William Caxton. I'm sure you are all familiar with the significance of this character in the history of English literature. William Caxton introduced a new type of printing, the movable type, to England in 1476. Caxton divided Mallory's tale into the chapters and books of a single long work as though it were a chronicle history, and gave it the title Le Mort d'Arthur, the death of Arthur, which of course has stuck to it ever since. Now, Caxton also printed so many other books, including the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer and some of Chaucer's earlier works. And of course, he also published Gower's Confessio Amantis. But his influence is not just because he was a printer, no. Caxton himself translated many of the works he printed for English readers. A History of Troy, a book on chivalry, Aesop's Fables, the history of Renard the Fox, and of course the game and the play of chess. And this new technology expanded literacy and made books. This is one of the things that you guys have to keep in mind, that the introduction of the movable type by William Caxton made printing more accessible, made books more accessible to new classes of readers. Now, printing made the production of literature a business and made possible the bitter political and doctrinal disputes that in the 16th century were waged in print as well as on the field of battle. Now, this brings our presentation of the literature in the Middle Ages to a conclusion. Once again, I just want to do a shout out to the Norton Anthology of English Literature. The discussions that you saw in these 3 videos were taken from it because this is primarily the book that I teach my students. So this brings our analysis of an overview of this period to a conclusion. So thank you so much for watching the video, and I'll see you guys in the next video.